my parents, their fighting at night began to escalate. Now, my brother and sister were fairly insulated from this because they were 2 and 4 years younger. But as I watched my parents battle louder and louder at night when we were in bed, and as I watched my dad disengage more, I began to think my parents might be the next ones up. And so I remember when my mom, on my 13th birthday, my mom came in and sat the kids down and gave us the, it's not your fault we're getting a divorce speech. And I remember vividly saying, finally.
From the Family Life Podcast Network, this is Family Life Blended. I'm Ron Deal. This donor-supported podcast brings together timeless wisdom and practical help and hope to blended families and those who love them. Welcome to episode number 51, Growing Up in a Blender, Play the Long Game. I'm so glad you've joined us in your blended family journey. Now, you may recognize the first part of that title, Growing Up in a Blender. We've done a series of podcasts on that theme before in which we listen to and talk with now adult children who recount the story of their childhood. Now, why do we do this? Well, so you, the listener, can learn from their narrative and perhaps see your own children with greater wisdom. Not everything we talk about is going to apply to your kids, but what does will help you be a better parent. Okay, before we jump in, I just got to remind you, Blended and Blessed, our worldwide one-day live stream event for blended family couples, is just around the corner. Saturday, April 24th, 2021. You can be anywhere in the world and be enriched by the speakers and conversations that are going to take place at this affordable, donor-subsidized event. Do me a favor, do yourself a favor. Visit blendedandblessed.com to learn more about it. blendedandblessed.com. Now, let's talk about growing up in a blender. My guest is Jim Ramos. After 20 years of local church ministry, Jim and his wife started a ministry to men called Men in the Arena. Today, that ministry reaches hundreds of thousands of men from 100 countries around the world. Jim is a nationally sought-after keynote speaker, author, and internationally known podcaster. He's written 10 books, including his latest, Strong Men, Dangerous Times. Jim and Shanna live near Portland, Oregon, and have 3 sons. Okay, so here's a question to be thinking about as you listen. Do you suppose any of Jim's ministry passion has been fueled by his experience growing up blended? Here's my conversation with Jim Ramos. Jim, you and I first met virtually on your podcast.
Yep.
And it was a blast. I got to tell you, thanks for having me on. For those who aren't familiar with your ministry, tell us about Men in the Arena.
Yeah, so first of all, thanks for getting me on the show. Yeah. I'm really excited about this and
I'm glad to have you.
Sharing the story of my blended experience. But we're over here in northern Oregon, about an hour south of Portland, in a little town called McMinnville. And Men in the Arena, we exist to inspire men to become their best version in Christ, because we believe wholeheartedly that when a man gets it, everyone wins. And so if we can get the man to understand who he is in Christ and to grow to that best version, it's going to change everything. And so that's really our passion, whatever we can do to reach men for Christ. And more than that, get them to understand who they are in Christ.
Yeah. So what are the kinds of activities that you guys have? I know you got some events, you do a podcast.
Yeah. So if you imagine a mountain, the base of our mountain is our free online resources. So we have the Men in the Arena podcast, which has been a huge asset. We've reached guys in 90 nations. We have a forum with about 10,000 guys from almost 100 nations on it. And then we offer a couple free resources within that. We're building an assessment where a man can assess his masculinity based off of the 20 qualifications of an elder in the Bible. And we're developing a 200-question assessment so guys can go and do that. Really, really excited about that. And so once guys enter into our free zone, which is the podcast and the forum, we ask them to invest in our resources and to get on a team. Really the bread and butter of the ministry is guys getting on teams, whether that be live, we call those local teams, or virtual, which virtual are our main option at this point. But once a guy does that, we really believe when a guy locks arms with other men in a small group environment, that guy really grows, and he in turn changes his world. And by his world, we're talking about his family and his inner circle.
Dude, I am a firm believer in community and the importance of that. We have seen that in blended family ministry as well. It is so very important to get blended couples together, even dating couples, go and sit with blended, already married couples and talk and listen and take some good information, but process it together, pray over it together, apply it towards your lives together. There's something really powerful that the Holy Spirit does in community that just doesn't happen anywhere else.
Well, and this, the bread and butter of the church, because we don't see heaven because we're here on earth. So salvation, I think, for the non-Christian world, they just kind of meh. But the thing that we bring to the table, Jesus said in John 13:35, this is how they'll know that you're my disciples, that you love one another. And I'll tell you, community is where it's at. The power of relationships is really a tremendous offering that the church has in the world to pull people out of isolation and into community. So I'm a huge fan.
Okay, we're going to put a link in our show notes so people will know how to find you and how to locate your information. I want all of the men represented by listeners right now, whether you're married to a man or you are one, you is one, check out Men in the Arena. One last question about your ministry. Okay, here's the really nice bump and set so you can spike. You ready? Why arena? What men in the what? In the arena? What does that mean?
Yeah, it's interesting. It actually came from a quote from Teddy Roosevelt, of all people, but it's the men are visual, and we want to give men a picture of what we want these men to do. And in churches today, we believe 80% of men sit in pews and they do nothing about their faith. They sit in the bleachers, they sit in the stands. In the stands, we have anonymity, we have apathy, and you're a consumer. We're asking guys to get out of the bleachers and actually step down onto the arena floor, pick up your sword, put on your helmet, and get in the game and start serving in your church, loving on your wife, sacrificing for your kids, investing in your community. Get down where the battle is going on and get out of the bleachers where nobody knows your name. And so it's a word picture, calling men out, calling men up, and calling them in.
Got it. Love it. That is a great ministry. Man, you spend your day helping men love and lead well. You get in the trenches with people, with their marriages, with their kids and their parenting. Now, if you're like me, because I do a lot of this myself, it makes you reflect on your own life a lot, right? Helping others,
Yeah.
You look at their situation, you're always reflecting on yourself. I don't know about you, but every lesson I try to give somebody else, I'm also going, okay, Ron, are you living up to that? It's very self-indicting. What I'm going to ask of you today is that you just walk us through your blended family experience. Looking back as a child, what was it like? But also bring to the table your adult perspective as a family ministry leader and help us just understand a little bit more of what it's like to be a kid. Okay? That's where we're going. So let me just start with this. How is it that you came to live in a blended family?
So I grew up as a child in the 70s, and I remember a couple things about that time of my life. So I was born in 1965. So we're talking, I'm an 8-year-old to a 10-year-old kid. I had a dad. I was the firstborn, and I had a dad who really, really drove me with sports. So very hard driven and a lot of times cruel. I'm very close to my dad now, but at the time it was cruel. Some of the things that he expected. During the 70s, I noticed something really interesting. All of my parents' couple friends were systematically getting divorced. And I noticed that as they were systematically divorcing, I thought, well, are my parents going to divorce? And my parents, their fighting at night began to escalate. Now, my brother and sister were fairly insulated from this because they were 2 and 4 years younger. But as I watched my parents battle louder and louder at night when we were in bed, and as I watched my dad disengage more with hunting and hobbies, I began to think my parents might be the next ones up.
Wow.
And quite frankly, at the time, I hate to say this because I'm embarrassed to say this, but I was hoping they would divorce on some level because the cruelty and the drive of my dad was painful as a little kid.
Yeah.
And so I remember when my mom came to me and told me that your parents gave us "it's not your fault, we're getting a divorce" speech. My mom came in, it was my 13th birthday. So this went on from about 8 or 9 years old till about 13. On my 13th birthday, my mom came in and said, "Hey, we sat the kids down and gave us it's not your fault, we're getting a divorce" speech. And I remember vividly saying, "Finally."
Wow.
I vividly remembered that because there are arguments late at night. There were arguments about adultery, and different names were flying around. So I knew who the names were, and I was involved I could hear the conversations, remember them vividly. And so I was glad that he was out. I was glad the marriage was over, not knowing what was coming next. It was in many ways even more difficult to handle. But at the time, I felt a sense of relief, quite frankly. And I'm embarrassed to say that because I'd never counseled divorce today, but at that time in my life, I was relieved. But that was my 13th birthday present.
Yeah. Before we jump into what comes next, let's just unpack and sit in that for a minute, because first of all, I would want to say to you, the clinician in me, the therapist in me wants to say, yeah, dude, no, feeling relief, there's no shame in that.
Yeah.
Obviously, home was not safe for you. Whether it's the fighting and the anger and the accusations and the blame and the conflict, and obviously you were hearing that. I don't know if they knew you were hearing that, but you were hearing that, and that's putting anxiety on your heart. And then that cruelty from your dad, not living up to his expectations. And I don't know, how did that make you feel? Do you mind unpacking that? You said it was painful. In what way?
Well, I think, and as an adult, I think I've worked through this about 3 years ago. So after I was 50 years old, I finally figured this out. I became obsessed with performance. And it wasn't performance because I loved to compete, as performance because I hated getting disciplined.
Yeah.
I remember one time I was an 8-year-old playing with in Little League I was the youngest in our league. 8-year-old was the youngest because you went 8 to 12 years old, and I was 8 or 9. So I was the youngest guy in the league, but I was always really big and thick. And I remember one game I hit a home run and I hit a triple, and I was on third base, and there was a guy on first base. The guy on first base stole first to second. They did a fake and threw me out at third. So here's this 9-year-old kid who hit a home run and a triple, but I remember driving, it was 10-mile drive home, and my dad screaming and cussing at me because I got picked off at third.
Man.
I mean, I already knew I was, so it was things like this, that high level performance. And my dad he regrets that. He's asked for forgiveness for that. But as a young guy, it causes you to really be fear driven and performance driven.
Right. Because if you can act good enough, then you're not going to receive that negative punishment and rejection. And by the way, how defeating to perform so well, but to just not quite be there. And that's the whole thing about performance. We never quite get there. We're never good enough.
Yeah. It's not sustainable.
Yeah.
And I remember, fast forward. So that team took third in city, and the next 2 years we won the city championship. And I remember hitting the game-winning home run to win the city championship game, and my dad walking up to me smiling and shook my hand. And it was like the greatest achievement of my life to get a smile and a handshake after a game instead of criticism. And so you get trained that performance elicits a positive response.
Yeah.
Instead of making a mistake. And the other problem was it developed in me a fear of failure, and oftentimes not even trying to do something risky because I was afraid that it might not succeed.
One of the things we know about how this type of thing shapes us in life, if you're normal, like the rest of us, I can imagine that even today, even though you fully understand this and can articulate it, but the people that you care about the most, you still fear disappointing them. You may every once in a while catch yourself kind of chasing your wife's approval and just trying to be the best you can be in the workplace, and just being driven to do everything you do well, and finding some balance with all of that. is one of those lifelong journeys where you try to undo that performance-based fear of failure thing. Can you relate to any of that?
Yeah, and I think for me, how it manifested was in self glorification. So I would get in a room with guys, and instantly you enter this contest of who's bigger, who's better, who's done more, whose group is bigger, whose influence is bigger. And until God revealed that in me and rid me of that, that was a massive problem. And so now when I enter a room, I try to elevate those around me, because I realize that God is validating me and I don't need to validate myself. It only took a half a century to figure that out.
Yeah, dude. Well, you did it faster than I did. I mean, so good for you. Yeah, seriously though, I mean, I just want to say to our listener, look, if you can relate to anything, if there's anything in your life as an adult you find yourself wrestling with in any aspect of your life, I bet you there's a little bit of a line back to childhood where you learned really fast. This, in your case, performance thing. I did too. Had a similar dynamic with my father, and wanting to be the best and wanting to do well. And it wasn't that I was living under the fear of derision or extreme anger or anything like that. It's just I wanted to live up to who I thought he thought I was, right? And it still resulted in this performance-driven sort of thing. Connecting those dots, understanding how we got to where we are is very important, because that is going to help us now live and do work and love the people that are in our lives. Okay, so we've got the picture, 8 to 13. You heard the conflict. Life was kind of tough between you and your dad. Finally, they say, we're divorcing. You feel some relief. Do you have a sense of what your two siblings felt?
I think they were fairly insulated and oblivious. They seemed... Now, I have to go back and say this. My brother was younger. He was weaker. He was smaller. My mom had the German measles when she was pregnant with him, and so he was born normal, but with some learning and physical weaknesses. And my sister was substantially younger. And so I feel like they were very insulated. My dad was never hard on them. He always told me, you are the protector, you are the defender. Don't ever fight unless somebody messes with your brother and sister, then you go to war. So I was always this incredible defender of the weak, and I still am to this day. So they were very insulated. And I remember when my dad and mom got divorced, my dad moved out, and my dad was was and still is the most engaged father I've ever been. I mean, the guy is so good about being engaged with his kids. So when my parents divorced, he moved about 10 miles away, and we saw him all the time. But I saw this breach in his morality as an opportunity for me to attack, because all of my 13 years of life, he'd attacked me when I had a failure.
And ironically, he had told you to defend other people against injustice, and this time it was against him.
Yeah, it really was. I remember going fishing one time. We're all sitting on the shore fishing steelhead in Cambria, California, and he started talking, and I just erupted on him, and I made him walk away crying. My brother and sister were yelling at me because they had no idea, but I just called out his adultery, and man, it felt good. But to watch your father cry, I'll tell you this, Ron, my dad's divorce broke him, and his failure broke him, and he became a different man after the divorce. And so I went from 13 years of being raised with a overbearing, aggressive, oftentimes cruel man to a broken, humble man who just wanted a relationship with kids. And that was a hard bridge for me to cross, to be honest with you, because he was married about 9 months, a year later.
Okay.
So now I went from a broken dad to a married dad to a stepbrother and stepsister who my dad had in his home now. But that was an interesting bridge to cross when you have a dad who goes from a cruel dictator to a broken, humble guy. It was interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I want our listener to pay attention, because we're going to jump into the shoes of a kid who feels that great sadness about his family coming apart, and at the same time maybe justified in being angry towards dad. And let's just explore what impact that had on you and your blended family. Let's just start with your dad for a second. Divorce broke him. First of all, I want to say hallelujah. And thank God we all have that same opportunity in life, right?
Yeah.
Through Jesus, we can recover from who we were to being who he makes us to be. So glad to hear that. But I hear in what you're saying, it was hard to forgive. It was hard to restore trust. Just because it broke him and began a process of changing him didn't mean you could let him off the hook. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, because at 13 years of age, certain things had been deeply solidified in my life. One, the performance equals validation was deeply, deeply ingrained. And two, your father is not a safe place, but he's a place that's safe when you perform. So those two things were deeply, deeply ingrained in me. And so even though I saw a broken, now realize I was not raised in a Christian family. So I want to really add that caveat. So for me, watching this brokenness, but it didn't lead him back anywhere except to his kids. His kids became everything. And in his second marriage, his kids became the center of the family relationship, not the marriage.
Okay.
So the second wife, my stepmom, she became the my kids are first, and if you don't like it, you can leave type of program, which it swung the other way.
Yeah. So she was on the outs, even with your father. Is that what you're saying? Like she knew his kids came first, and she was going to have to honor that, or else.
Yeah, which is the problem, I think, in second marriages,
Yes.
because even in a second marriage, the marriage comes before the kids.
Yes.
But people enter that second marriage broken and wounded from the first marriage and guarded. And this concept of kids come first is a way to ruin the second marriage.
Mm-hmm.
And so my mom or my stepmom and my dad have been married for 45 years, but it's been a struggle for them. And most of their struggles have revolved around her handling of her children and my dad's. She's great with us. She's a phenomenal stepmother, but a lot of their relationship struggles revolved around the kids because they came before the marriage.
So going back to 13, 14, dad's now married. How did you view her? Was she the enemy? Was she, what was that like? And how did bonding go in the early phases?
Yeah, again, I was the oldest, so I was the slowest to accept her. She was, quote, the other woman. She was the one who I heard mentioned in arguments. My dad says that they never had any kind of physical adulterous affair, but it was definitely an emotional affair looking back on it. And so I was bitter and angry.
Yeah.
And even though I realized the cruel nature of my dad as a father, I viewed her in some ways as the villain in the story that broke my parents up. So, which is not true, as I learned later, it wasn't true. But so it took longer for me to accept her, even though she's a wonderful woman and she was a wonderful stepmother. But she entered the marriage realizing that I was going to be the problem for her.
That was evident on the front end, right?
Yeah, I could tell early on she was trying to win me.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, to our listener, if you've ever heard me say, and if you've heard any of my podcasts, you've probably heard me say at some point or another, loss gets in the way of bonding. Loss in the past gets in the way of bonding in new blended relationships. And you just heard that from Jim. The loss of his family, even though, by the way, I'll just throw in this observation, even though it was a relief for you that mom and dad broke up, still there was a sense of injustice about it and pain and disruption. And, it was still wrong. And so the object of your pain quickly becomes your stepmom. She's the one to blame. It's got to go somewhere. And dad carried some of that blame, and she carried some of that blame for you. And so that pain of the loss gets in the way of you being able to move toward her. Here she's chasing you in terms of trying to build a relationship. Did you pick up on that as a 14, 15-year-old?
Absolutely. I mean, she knew that I knew things the others didn't. And she tried extra hard. Now, it's interesting, Ron, if I flip that to the other side, my mom got remarried about a year and a half later.
Okay. And
because my mom was not vilified by us kids, we stayed with her. The man she married became this cool guy we really liked. But now my sister rebelled against him because now we're living in a home. He bought my dad's half of the home. So now we're living in a home that my parents lived in, and he's sleeping in the bed my dad slept in, and he's bought the house my dad bought. And so even though he was not the father of my sister, it was his house. And as such, we followed his rules, and his rules were very, very liberal. We did not have a lot of rules. It was very, very easy to do whatever we want. And my sister still rebelled against that because he was seen by her as the villain in the story, where I viewed my stepmother as the villain. So you had two different dynamics going on within about a year apart of each other.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, by the way, if your sister had a decent relationship with your dad.
Yeah, I would say from a Christian ministry guy looking back 40 years, I think my dad was outstanding at being physically present and horrible at being emotionally engaged. And so I remember him telling her, "Oh, you're like a little ugly duckling," like little comments like that, like calling me hose nosy. He could be very cruel at times. And so I don't think he emotionally filled her tank.
Okay.
He loved her and he verbalized it, but she grew up, I think, emotionally empty,
But loyal to him.
but loyal to him because he was an engaged parent and he was there, but he had this cruel side, this teasing side to him that I think deeply affected her, and even to this day affects her.
Yeah. And let me just point out to the listener, how did I know to ask the question about her relationship with your father? Because there's a triangle there, and it's a very predictable pattern that her loyalty to her dad makes it really difficult for her to embrace her stepdad. And in this case, she vilified him and just, couldn't receive him into her heart. Again, loss makes it difficult to bond in new relationships. I'm wondering if you and your sister ever had any difficulties. Like, I just mean you blame different people and kind of had loyalties with different parents. I don't know.
That's really a good question. I am very close to my siblings as an adult. And growing up, I remember, because we lived in the same house, her and I had many arguments because I just could not see why she was rebelling, because we had no rules. I mean, honestly, my mom would say, if you go out and get drunk and party, we don't care. Just let me know that you're doing. And we had no rules, but my sister, even having no rules, my sister broke them. And so we had a lot of arguments at times because we meaning my brother and I, we could not understand why she was rebelling because there were no rules.
Yeah. Again, how did I know to ask the question? It's a little predictable given that their loyalties ended up with different parents on different sides. I just want to pause and say, okay, you guys are 14, 15, 10, your brother and sister, they're younger than you. This is hard ground to navigate. This is battle front warfare stuff going on, emotional games between parents and exes and new ones. And you're a kid. Like, that's just hard to know what to do or how to feel in all of that. I mean, another way to ask this is, who is coming alongside you and providing some guidance and a little emotional safety to help you know how to deal with all this hard stuff? Was there anybody?
I'm very close to my mother. And so in all of this, I thought she was the victim. She never lived as a victim. She was a bank manager. She went to work and did well, but I don't remember any one support person outside of probably my mother.
So how did you cope with all that? Because that's a lot of stress. It's a lot of anxiety. It's a lot of ambiguity. New people coming in. Like, how did you manage that from, being a teenager?
I know for me, and I'm not sure if this was a default or if I did this consciously or subconsciously, but I was super busy with sports and school, and I worked because
performing.
Performing, and even having to pay for my car insurance and gas. So I mean, I remember my schedule in high school was sports, go to work on Friday nights. I'd cook fish and chips Friday nights, Saturday nights, Sunday after I'd cook Sunday mornings, and then Tuesday nights was a senior citizens night. So I'd go after football practice or basketball or baseball and cook there. So it just was never ending. I just never had time off. And that might have served me well because I didn't have that downtime to deal with it. So,
just in a very general way, most of us, when we have instability in our life and aren't sure who loves us and how and under what conditions, we tend to move towards either control or chaos. Control is what you did. That's the performance stuff, the get it right, the be on top of it all, stay in charge. The other extreme is chaos. In other words, kind of irresponsibility. Sometimes it's, sexual behavior, drug, alcohol behavior, kind of crazy stuff, just trying to, hey, whatever happens, that's kind of the coping mechanism. And some people kind of vacillate between those two. So you went the performance route. That was deep in you by that point. I'm curious about your siblings.
Oh, you know what my sister did?
Yeah, you already told us when
she went the chaos route.
She
became, she partied hard, and she became a meth addict in her mid-20s, and she's journeying back beyond that. But now she struggles with. She just stopped smoking at 50, so I'm really proud of her. But she struggled with alcohol and smoking and different things. My brother, I would say somewhere in the middle, but my brother has become a very controlling person. He has learned that his world is a lot easier if it's rigid and highly black and white. And so he lives in that world. But he grew up in the shadow of Jim's little brother. So he had so my brother and sister will tell you that they ran the high school when I was there because it was very clear you do not touch Jim Ramos's brother and sister. And so they did have the support from me. They knew that I was their support. I wasn't a parental figure, but they just knew that in me, they were safe.
You had their back. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the between home stuff. Moving between mom's house and stepdad, dad's house and stepmom. I'm wondering about the transition. How did that work for you? I'm wondering about rules. Were they different? Were they similar? The emotional climate, just navigating that space for you. What was it like?
So my mom was very laid back. In fact, my buddies, like I said, I was very busy in high school. My buddies would go get drunk and come to my house and hang out with my mom. And numerous times I come home and my drunk friends are in the living room hanging out with my mom and stepdad, because they were the laid back, cool couple, right? I remember, this is going to sound appalling now. I thought it was the greatest thing ever. I remember early in my senior year of high school, I came home, my stepdad said, hey, let's watch a porn together. So I watched my first porn to a round table pizza with my stepdad. I just thought, man, this is the coolest thing ever. But that's the kind of family I grew up with there. My dad, on the other hand, was a high school teacher and coach and a driver's ed teacher. And so he had a network of students who would tell him everything that we did with our lives. I remember actually he drove to 30 miles with his driver's ed car to a lake where we had a keg and a party. And just to make, he was always the guy. So he was extremely vigilant in making sure I lived a certain way. And that way was, not party and not sleeping around, that type of thing. I remember one time I was dating a girl my sophomore year of high school, and she was known as a lascivious young lady. Let's put it that way. And he followed me on the bus. He followed me in the car to my house to tell me I needed this girl, type of thing. And so I had extremely different family environments. And then what I didn't tell you is my dad lived with my stepsister and stepbrother. So she moved out early on. She was probably a junior or senior in high school. My stepbrother was a year younger than me. So we all hung out together. We played football together. So we were close, and we all went to the same high school. My mom married a guy who had 3 kids, and one of them was my exact age. And so we dealt with a little bit of a sibling attraction there for a little bit, or early on. It didn't last very long and nothing happened, but middle school kids. But
yes.
So we grew up and we saw them on holidays. They were the holiday siblings.
Huh. Wow. Okay, so just for the listener who's trying to keep up, we've got 3 different households at this point. We've got 4 different parent figures, and we've got, if my count is right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 children.
8 children, correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That doesn't
2
count,
on one family, 3 on one, and then
3 in the middle. That doesn't count all the grandparents, right? So if you're trying to keep up, just imagine being a kid. You're navigating all these spaces and all these people, and you got a stepsister who's cute. Like, what do you do with that?
So let me tell you this, just to give you a little better dynamics. My mom is Marcia. My stepdad was Jim.
Okay.
Jim was married to Marcia. Marcia was married to Jim. Jim and Marcia divorced, and Jim married Marcia.
Another Marcia.
Yes. So my dad is Jim. My grandpa's Jim. I'm Jim. My stepdad's Jim. My stepbrother's Jim. My sister's first husband was Jim.
I'm glad we
So
got this
it
on tape
changed.
because I'll never remember.
So it definitely got interesting. There were a lot of Jims. So back to my stepsister. So my mom and stepdad dated for about a year and a half when we were pretty young. I would say we were pre-teen, pre-adolescent.
Okay.
And so they broke up, and then when they got back together, I went from this chubby 5th grader to this 6 foot tall, 175-pound 8th grader. And my stepsister went from this little girl to this fully developed 13-year-old.
Got it.
And it almost got ugly. It didn't.
Yeah.
But there was an attraction there that both of us recognized this is not good, even as middle school kids, and nothing ever happened. But there was definitely, and then my stepsister on my dad's side was 3 years older than me, and she was beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah. And how can you not notice, right? I just want to say to our listener, this is a subject we have not dealt with yet on our podcast. I do write about this in the book, The Smart Step Family. I do have an article that is available on my personal website, smartstepfamilies.com. And I will say this, quietly over the years, When Step Siblings Have Sex is the title of that article, has had as many or more hits than most of the other articles on my website. It has been a much searched and people link to it. Why? Because that's a common dynamic. There's not a natural taboo against seeing a step sibling as in a romantic way. Now, the reason incest is so incredibly rare in biological family units is because there is a natural taboo built into that. You know, if somebody says to you, I want you to imagine your parents having, you go, yuck, I don't want anything part of it. Imagine your sister being attracted, your brother being attracted. Like, no, like there's nothing in us that goes there. But that taboo doesn't exist in step-sibling relationships. And so there's this natural, you can't help but notice sort of thing that happens. And on occasion, that blossoms into something more than that. And that creates some boundary struggles for the family. And they've got to rethink, how do we do, walking out of the bedroom into the bathroom across the hall, and just all of the different pieces which I just want to point people to those resources I just mentioned, because I do try to deal with those things in a very proactive way. But I appreciate you sharing that. I think it's more common than people realize.
Well, and once the marriage happened, both of us were like, whoa, okay, we're sister, brother. And so it never even was a temptation ever. We moved into this role that was very natural, that was, you're my family now. So it did transition, but there was a time there where it could have gotten a little bit crazy.
Yeah. Moving between households. So one household was very boundaryless. Your mom and stepdad's household. Dad was trying to keep the reins on everything, it sounds like. By the way, was that motivated by any spiritual value in his life at that point?
Nothing.
Okay.
No, he was born and raised Catholic, but at that point had just abandoned it.
Okay.
So I think that moral code was there.
Got it. So the moral code he was pursuing. So how, if I can use the word loosely, schizophrenic is that for you? One household, boy, Dad's tracking me down because he heard that I might be with so-and-so or having it, whatever. And at mom and stepdad's house, there's no boundaries, no limits. In fact, they're encouraging lascivious sort of behavior. So where do you live in that space?
It just was the new normal for us.
Yeah.
I just knew that when I was at my mom's, I could exhale. And when I was at my dad's, I had to just be aware of what was going on. Now, my dad he is a big time hunter and fisherman, sportsman. And I love that. And my brother loved that. So we spent a lot of time with Dad hunting and fishing and doing that. So when we were doing that with him, that was really our sweet spot. And that's really what has held us together all these years. But it was outside of that, sports. He would be what you would call a helicopter parent, I would think. Back then, he coached me in every team in high school. On the football team, he was always my football coach. He was my head varsity baseball coach. And there was a lot of clashing because he wanted me to live at this value. And I always would kind of in my mind travel back to when I was 13 and go, wait, but you did these things. So you're not living to the value you set for me. There was a moral gap there. And we would go at it a lot. a lot of arguing. Now I am Italian and Portuguese, so that's pretty normal for our culture. But we would have these things where at my mom's house, it was very peaceful. I already was an overachiever. So for me, you didn't need to give me rules. I was going to play by the rules because the rules gave me trophies and caused me to perform. So I naturally was able to do that. But my mom's the mom. When I was 18, I went to the high school. I wrote a note. She wrote a note that says, Jimmy can ditch school whenever he wants. And I did. I did whatever I wanted. I could write my own notes. And she just didn't care. And my dad never knew.
Okay, dude, I got to fast forward a little bit because having grown up with those two spiritual climates,
yeah.
How did you ever come to put your faith and trust in Christ?
So I actually had a freshman basketball coach. He was a Campus Life director, Campus Life Youth for Christ. And he roped all of us kids in, all the guys on the team to, go to different games. And the two guys that were our coaches were our Campus Life directors. And we didn't know what that meant, but that meant they were Christians. So they're always trying to tell us about Jesus, right? So it got a little annoying, but we got through that year. We had a good season. And my senior year, he shows up again as one of my football coaches. And he said, hey, I want to help you guys win football games. I want to do this group on Thursday mornings, and you're the team captain. Will you get this thing going? I go, hey, I'll do anything to win football games. So we would meet once a week on Thursdays, and he would start preaching to us about Jesus. And we're all sitting there with fried egg eyes. But I remember he was the first guy. I was born and raised Catholic, but I remember one time he and I talking about my parents' divorce, saying, hey, and I told him, I remember exactly where I was at. I know exactly where we were driving. I remember I was holding an Aerosmith Toys in the Attic cassette because I had just had a birthday. It was basically the 3rd year anniversary for my parents' divorce. And I remember telling him, hey, Gary, I have no problem with God, but I will never go to church again. And he said something to me that rocked my world. He said, Christianity is not about a religion. It's about a relationship with God. And that rocked my world. And by the end of my senior year, outside of a pizza place, he led me to Jesus. He led me to Christ, and that was really where I, for the first time, understood what it meant to be a Christian. And he's the vice president of Men in the Arena, the organization, to this day. To this day, we're very close. Yeah, I told him, you led me to the Lord, so you got me into this, so you're coming on my board.
I love that. That is really
yeah,
great.
they say that there's like 6 degrees of separation to Kevin Bacon.
Uh-huh.
We say there's 3 degrees of separation with Gary McCusker.
Okay, so how did the faith then begin to take root in you? Again, you're high school senior, there's all kinds of transition going on, thinking about moving out of the home, college, whatever, and yet 2 households that really don't share that faith. Where did that leave you?
Yeah, so my faith did not manifest fully until 4 years later. I had a real bad knee surgery where I was overdosed by an anesthesiologist. I went code blue.
Wow.
I was blind for 3 days in ICU. And as a 19-year-old teenager, God spoke to me and said, I want you to make a difference in the lives of teens. So it was the first time I'd ever heard the voice of God. It was literally a call to ministry, and I wasn't even serving God. And it took me about 3 more years. So by the time I was 22, I fully embraced Christ and understood what it meant to be a follower of Jesus. And I entered full-time ministry 6 months later. Ironically, I was living at my dad's house at the time. And so I came back from college. I had a full-ride scholarship at a very prestigious university, Santa Clara University. And I came back and announced I'm going to full-time ministry. And my dad kicked me out of the house. And so he did not understand. And in his mind, again, performance, right? And so and performance equals dollars, money and success. And I had decided I didn't want that. I wasn't going to be motivated by money. I was going to be motivated by the will of God. And that meant ministry, and ministry meant poverty, in my opinion. And that's what I did. And so my mom, on the other hand, gave her life to Christ. So I had, again, mom, very close to mom, and dad was the performance guy. Huh. And so we had this different separation. And so since then, it's been an interesting journey. One of my step siblings is a supporter of our ministry and is a really solid Christian. My sister's coming along nicely. My mom is a believer, but my stepdad tragically committed suicide in 2012. And so he never got to that point. But and my dad says he prays every night before he goes to bed. And so there's
something in there.
Well, for me, what happened, Ron, was with your family, you've got to play long ball.
Mm-hmm.
I won all of the discussions and theological arguments, but that doesn't matter in transforming a life. You have to live a life of faithfulness to Jesus, and you have to do it for decades. So your parents and the closest to you see that you've been changed by Christ. And that's how that dynamic played out.
Dude, I just want to sit with that for a minute, because I'm thinking right now of somebody who's listening who it's a different application of that. They're a step parent and they've just run to the end of the street and keep hitting their head against the brick wall of the child that won't let them in. And, maybe the way you responded to your stepmom for a season, or the way your sister responded to your stepdad for a season. And they just heard you say, play long ball.
Yep.
Stay in the game, be a loving presence that just continues to walk with them. I'm thinking of the listener right now who's sitting there going, man, I don't know how our marriage stays together. Play the long game. Hang in there. Don't just quit. Don't make rash decisions. I'm thinking of a kid who's listening right now, somebody who maybe is, a parent handed them this podcast so they could just listen to somebody else's story. Or maybe they're an adult now looking back on their childhood as you are, and they're thinking, there's just so many things I regret, so many things I couldn't change, so many things that I did the best I could, but, boy, I was just dealing with the mess that was going on around me. And they're hearing you say, play the long game. Just stay after it. Walk with Christ and be an influence in the process to those that are around you. Man, that's good.
Well, what's interesting, Ron? I look at my stepmom and even my stepfather. They were great. And neither of them come from a Christian background. What both of them did really, really well is they realized that I had a mom I was close to and I had a dad I was close to. They could not replace those, and they didn't want to. And what I would tell a step parent right now is you are not the parent, but you can be a great advocate. And if you advocate for that stepchild, you will win them over. But don't try to be the advocate.
Yeah, that's a good word. What did that look like in your case from your stepmom or stepdad? How did they advocate for you?
Yeah, for my stepdad, it looked like every game that I played, and I played a lot of them, he was there. He took my mom to my college games. They were there. So that was a big deal to me to see that happen. For my stepmom, it was tolerating my dad was part of it and his struggles, but she really came alongside my sister. My sister rebelled, and so my sister and my stepmother became very, very close. And my stepmom, whenever there was a need, my stepmother met it. And whenever there was a pushback from my dad, or my dad was really struggling, or he tends to be very explosive, she would temper him. And so I always knew that she would temper him, and in so doing, she protected us.
And you respected her because of that.
I did, and she has won me over, and she did that pretty fast. But even today, she's my dad's caregiver. She's 82 and he's 78, and she does a lot of his care. And she's just, because of who she naturally is, over time, she won me over. And I had to realize as a kid, this is my dad's relationship. This is my mom's relationship. It's not my relationship. And I don't want to make it hard for them to have a successful relationship. I've already seen the nastiness of one divorce, and I want to advocate for these second marriages because my parents love these people.
Wow. Yeah, that was very insightful of you as a kid to see that on their behalf. I want to just point out to our listener, in case they forgot, this stepmom who won you over, you vilified in the beginning.
Yeah, for about a year and a half.
And her long game paid off? Is that a good way to say it?
100% paid off.
Wow. Man, you shared with me, when I was on your podcast, we were talking, you were just telling some of this story. I've learned so much more today. But I'll never forget, you mentioned that you never told your stepdad or your stepmom that you loved them. I think that's the way you said it.
Yeah.
But that you have been able to say that to your biological parents. Take us inside that, just for somebody who's listening right now who just doesn't quite get why that child or that stepchild just can't let them in. What was that about for you?
Yeah, I don't know if I'd use the phrase let them in, because I would let them into a lot of areas. But for me, to say I love you. I didn't start saying I love you to my dad until like the last couple years.
Okay.
So my dad and he never could articulate that. My mom says it's till it's boring. And so for me, saying I love you was really a deep and special position. It was a position in my life, and I was not going to bring my step parents into that. I would say I love my stepmom and I loved my stepdad, but it was more of a phileo love. It was not a agape love. It was a different love. And, it's really interesting as well. I love my brother and sister, tell them I love them all the time. We still do that as adults. And I have a stepsister, I will say that too, but that's the only one, the Christian one, because she understands it. But the other ones, we have not let each other into a soul level. And so the Christian part of our faith has really helped us to love each other as actual siblings. But the parenting thing, I let them in, I respected them and loved them, but I felt like to call them mom or to call them dad was a position that only their biological children could do. And to tell my stepmother or stepfather I love them was not my right. It was their children's right. And their children didn't even tell them that. So you've got a whole nother dynamic going on. Neither of my stepmom or my stepdad, their kids never said I love you to their parents. And so who was I to go and rob that? That's their right, not mine.
Wow. I think the big takeaway for listeners is Gary Chapman and I, in our book, Building Love Together in Blended Families, talk about different love associations, the nature of different relationships. Love means different things about different people. I love my mother-in-law, but it's not the same as how I love my mom. I love, one sibling differently than I love another sibling. You loved your step-parents, but not in the sense like you love your biological parents, and so the words I love you just weren't appropriate in those relationships. That makes total sense to me. And the other observation I have is that, and we say this all the time in our ministry, blended families are a process, and you're still in process. So even now, those relationships for you are developing and evolving over time as the relationships mature. So, one of the big problems that biological parent and step-parent have is, why doesn't everybody love each other to the same degree? And I think you're just hearing this narrative, from a child's point of view. It's just difficult. People fit in different categories in your heart, and those expressions of love will take the shape that it needs to take for the child at that particular time. So don't fret that it's not exactly the way you want it. Rest in what is and keep hoping and trusting for more, but just keep walking as Christ, and that makes it more likely that the relationships will grow.
I would also add, Ron, that I've got a library of about 2,000 books, and I read about 40 books a year. And I just want to tell your listeners that your book, the book you wrote with Gary Chapman, is by far and away the best book I've ever read on blended families and how to deal with divorce. And anybody listening, if you are from a blended family, that book has to be in your library. It will help you and guide you. It'll be your compass in so many ways. You just need to get that book. So that's my own opinion.
I appreciate it, man. I really do.
Yeah.
I got one last question for you.
Yep.
We started our conversation pretty quickly. We kind of happened on some of those, we'll call them bruises and coping styles that you picked up as a young teenager that still sort of linger today. Do you have a sense of when any other bruises on your heart kind of flare up, when they get activated, the little pieces that are left over from those days of instability and uncertainty? You've been listening to my conversation with Jim Ramos. I'm Ron Deal, and this is Family Life Blended. We'll hear Jim's answer to that question in just a minute. Did you notice how much Jim had to push against his parents through his childhood? Push against. Let me tell you what I mean by that. What is developmentally optimal for kids is that their parents pull them into adulthood. No, it's not that we do all the work. We're trying to empower them to do their own work. But we do nurture and support and encourage their developing self. We try to help them step further and further into adulthood over time. And through that process, we're the ones they look up to and they lean on when they need somebody. We lead, they follow, and as they find their own identity, we lead less and less. Now, Jim, being the oldest sibling, had to parent his siblings in some ways, but he also had to parent his parents. For a season, on his mom's side, no one was leading. It's the way it sounds. So Jim had to set the boundaries when his parents wouldn't. He had to be discerning about what was wise behavior, especially after coming to Christ and seeing the value of a moral compass. And in some ways, he had to push against the decisions of his parents that caused him and his siblings some heartache. I share all this to say this. Sometimes kids who have been caretaking and overly responsible and carrying the burden of the family, they don't know how to stop. They won't stop unless a parent begins to be a parent again and not act like a child. If you're listening right now and this is you, right? You've been remiss, you've been irresponsible and unavailable. The best thing you can do for your kid is to grow up. Step back into parenting. Take charge of leading them rather than making them push against you. If you'd like more information about my guest, you'll find it in our show notes, or you can check it out on the Family Life Blended podcast page at familylife.com/blended podcast. And while you're there, check out everything Family Life has for your marriage and family. Our division, Family Life Blended, has the world's largest collection of articles and videos, resources, and books for blended families, like The Smart Stepmom, and a one-year devotional called Daily Encouragement for the Smart Step Family. Check us out. The show notes will tell you how. We would love to hear from you. You can give us a rating or write a review. Crystal wrote in on Facebook. She says, this material has been marriage saving for us. So glad to hear that. And one gentleman shared on YouTube, I can't adequately put into words how helpful this podcast has been. Family Life Blended is informational, helping me understand what's happening in certain situations and the feelings behind what is driving behavior and what I can do about it as a stepdad. It's comforting. Somehow knowing others are going through the same challenges helps. And it's reassuring. Thank you for providing this help. It is so good. Well, we are glad to hear that, and we hope that others are impacted as well. If someone sent you a link to this episode, you can subscribe. Maybe you didn't know that, but you can. You can do that on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also listen on YouTube, and you can listen on the new and improved Family Life app, which lets you take notes while you listen. Now, I told you earlier about Blended and Blessed, our worldwide one-day live stream event coming up April 24th. Our theme this year is Walk in Love, and it will include a number of dynamic speakers. And here's a really cool part. Churches, even if just virtually, churches can host the event and bring blended family couples together. Maybe you can start a ministry in your church or community. Go to blendedandblessed.com to learn how you can attend from home or in conjunction with others. That's blendedandblessed.com. Now, I asked Jim Ramos to talk about those bruises that remain on his heart. Let's hear what he had to say.
Yeah, two come to mind. I don't know if these fit your question, but I have a very high maintenance marriage. It's been a high maintenance marriage since 1992, and I love this woman. I mean, I love her, and we have a wonderful marriage. Last week, I ranked our marriage an 8, and then I went and asked her, and she gave me a 7 because we can do better. And so she's my best friend. But I know early on, and this still creeps up because we have a high maintenance marriage. Divorce for us is not an option. I will not marry couples who have divorce on the table as an option. So whenever a couple asks me to marry them, I ask them this question: if divorce is an option under any circumstance, I won't do your wedding. And the reason for that is because I've been scarred by divorce. Now I'm healed, but I have the scars to show for it. And so for me, I'm passionate about making a marriage work. I think people throw words around that don't exist just to get out of a marriage because they're weak or lazy or selfish. And I just am committed to marriage. I'm committed. And so the second thing is, for me personally, I want my kids and my 3 sons, their wives and my grandchildren to hear until it is boring the words "I love you." I just think that is so important that they hear those. And I think that a step parent can use those words. Don't expect it to be reciprocated, but it's okay to use those words. One of my sons has a girlfriend who we tell her we love her, and every time we do, she melts in our arms because you can tell she just really needs to hear it. And so for us, telling our kids we love them until it's actually boring. I've got these manly 26, 24-year-old kids saying I love you, and people look at them, and it's just like, I think it's so important that we remind our kids that we just really love them, no matter what.
And there's what can happen when one generation decides to turn the tide, that they are not going to live the same way that they were brought up, and that they're going to do better, and they're going to bring the Lord with them. And in one generation, it changes the course of your family. Next time, we're going to hear from a number of blended family experts when we go backstage to the 2019 Blended and Blessed live stream.
What people don't realize is men and women, we have two actually very different sets of insecurities running under the surface.
And I have none.
Exceptions. None. You have none at all.
Men don't have that.
None.
That's the 2019 Blended and Blessed live stream backstage with Robin Rondaboo, Lauren Reitzema, Janine McKenzie, Shanti Feldhahn, and yours truly next time on Family Life Blended. I'm Ron Deal. Thanks for listening. And thanks to our Family Life Legacy partners for making this podcast possible. If you want to help, you can. You can help us produce this podcast and other resources by making a tax-deductible donation specifically for Family Life Blended by going to familylife.com/blendedpodcast and clicking the donate button. Or just look in the show notes for a link. Our chief audio engineer is Keith Lynch, Bruce Goff, our producer. Our mastering engineer is Justin Adams, project coordinator Ann Ancaro, and theme music provided by Braden Deal. Family Life Blended is produced by Family Life and is part of the Family Life Podcast Network.